this, my favorite quote about all of this in terms of like media's effect on people is that Chuck Norris was interviewed about Walker, Texas Ranger, and one of the questions he was asked was like, you know, your show is watched by like 14-year-old boys all the time, and basically it's extremely violent. How do you respond to the fact that you're teaching kids to be violent? He's like, of course I'm teaching kids to be violent. I'm teaching them to beat up bad people. Right? And he's like, and as you watch the show, that's what happens. Someone does something bad and then we beat them up. So the moral is, if you do something bad, you get beat up, and you should beat up bad people. And to me, there's something really interesting about that, because it's like, well, that's an ethic, right? I mean, I don't know if I agree with it, but it's an ethic, and it's there. And I think that the issue that comes up around this a lot, and I think the book analogy is amazing. I think that's exactly what it is that books don't exist for educational purposes. They exist, and they serve a host of different purposes, from aesthetic purposes, to political purposes, to educational purposes, to selfish purposes. I mean, they serve numerous different roles, but we understand that like a book is situated in a certain place, in a certain context, and that we're going to introduce that book in a certain way. So maybe we don't give this book to our 10-year-old children, right? Or maybe if we're going to look at Mein Kampf in an environment, we're going to talk about the context, the history of that book, the role of that book, and really analyze it. And I mean, and I used to teach English. For God's sakes, like if you look at stuff from like like a lot of the books we read from like the 18th century and 19th century in America, not so good about racism, not so good about sexism, and you have to have the talk at the beginning of the class that's like, okay, Sonya's not really a great character in Dostoevsky. In Crime and Punishment, not an awesome character, a little bit sexist. Everybody got it? Got it? Sexist character? Okay, can we go on to talking about the book now? And I think that kind of framing is essential. Now, I don't think games fit into the same category, because I think that games have a potential for interactivity that I think does challenge this in a slightly different way. And I think it's dishonest, as much as I would love, because my interest in games is specifically associated around games and their artistic potential. So I would love to be able to say that games can explore all of this stuff wildly, can range this whole field of content from violence to sex to bias, to horror, and not affect people. But if I'm going to accept that games are art, I have to say it can affect people, right? And so we can have Triumph of the Will too in games. Like that's certainly possible. So I think the issue there is to just stop treating games either like they're going to be this sort of savior thing that exists, that sort of came into being for the purpose of educators to teach kids the periodic tables better, but also not to treat games as if the devil spawned them onto the earth to create corrupt minions. It's like they're a medium, they're an art form. They exist on the same spectrum that everything else does. But I think that actually raises an interesting question that goes back to a point, if you don't mind me tangenting a little bit, it goes back to a point that was raised earlier about the difference between teaching games that teach students and games that teach non-students. And one of the differences is they're not students. Like, no one's forcing them to do it. It's not in a classroom environment. Like, it's not surrounded by another kind of context. And I think that cuts all sorts of different ways. On the one hand, it means your game competes in the larger field of games, which is a big field full of lots of money and people who've been working really hard to figure out how entertainment works. But on the flip side, it means that you can start to educate in ways that would not be acceptable necessarily under a current metric structure without any real concern at all, because you could just do it, and if it's there, it's there. I mean, the analogy I always give is how all my friends know the geography of the Caribbean like the back of our hands because we played pirates, right? So we just sailed the Caribbean over and over and over and over again. Now we know where all the islands are. We had no intention of doing that. That's not why we played pirates. I didn't want to know where San Juan was. But like I now do, and I feel like that wasn't accidental. I don't think that was something that was just sort of like, I don't think it was just historical verisimilitude. I think that there was an intention to like teach you something about the economy in that period and the geography of that region and the kind of colonial powers that were at work, and I learned it. So I think there's a host of issues that come up when you start approaching things from the commercial sector, because the commercial sector's interests are different, but also because the constraints that you would find in other environments can be released.
I also think that in terms of the demand and kind of the games that are picked up on by politicians that sort of exploit the fact that they're very violent. I mean, some of it does have to do with the massive amounts of money that a blockbuster game like Grand Theft Auto generates, and also the attention that it gets. And if there was a blockbuster game that was highly entertaining as well as educational, that got a lot of press, that sold millions of dollars, I think that the tide might turn a little, because I was talking to an executive from EA the other day, and they said that their concern was that the majority of their games are actually family-oriented. Their ESRB ratings are for everyone, but the games that people notice are the ones that, you know, have a bad rating and have shock value, and that's what they get the most press for people who aren't necessarily gamers. And if, you know, there are more games like Brain Age, I think, you know, maybe there'll be more positive attention shown on the video game industry.
Wait, can I yeah, then I'll get to your question. So you just did an interesting thing that you correlated positive and educational, that something is educational when it's positive. And I think this is actually at the crux of Wade's question, that, again, if we accept that games are learning environments, there's an open question about what they give out, right?